So thrilled to be joined by Kristian Ramos. He's the communications director of Define American. Kristian, thanks so much for joining the show.
I'm glad to be here. I mean, it is a really exciting time in our nation's capital. No, I mean, honestly, if you look back a week ago, 2 weeks ago, things were looking pretty grim. And I want to take a step back from the he said, she said, and the political stuff, because I really want to take a moment to humanize this.
I really appreciate you doing that.
At the end of the day, this is not about politics. This isn't just about legislation. This is about people. This is about Americans. And it's important that we continue to recognize that whether or not you have DACA, whether or not you're undocumented, you will be affected by this program going away.
So help us understand, for folks who may not be familiar with the nuts and bolts, what is DACA? It's an acronym that gets thrown around, but it's critical for close to 1 million people's legal status.
Well, so beyond the technical aspects of it, which we'll clearly define as, people who were brought to this country when they were young, who have been in this country for their whole life, who have, in many cases, never been in their or remember their country of origin, and they're Americans. And it's important for everybody to sort of realize these are your local firemen, right? These are local police officers. These are, in fact, paramedics who are working in Houston, saving people's lives. Some of these folks have given their life out there, and it's not about the best and the brightest of the undocumented, folks. It's about everyday people. And I really want to underline that, because it's also important that people realize you may be losing your teacher in the future if this isn't addressed, right? You may be losing your child's teacher. You may be losing the person who took care of your ailing grandmother, right? You may be losing some folks that are near and dear to you. The person that you get coffee from every day, you don't necessarily know who does or does not have DACA. So for us, at Define American, we're really focused on the stories and the people and what's going on in their lives, because that's critically important to this particular fight.
Because your organization was actually created, just to jump in and give him some credit, Jose Antonio Vargas, who is the creator of Define American, he himself is an undocumented American who sort of came out publicly and said, you may know me as a writer, you may know me as a documentary filmmaker, but guess what, I'm undocumented, and I'm just like all these other people who are actually at risk under this agenda.
Absolutely. And again, I think the most heartening part of this whole thing, I can't say what's in President Trump's heart, but the fact that they're having these conversations, that they're going back and forth in Congress, and they're looking at a way to do this, I think is important. And at the end of the day, we don't know what all this is going to look like, but there's forward momentum. People are having conversations, and I think that's an important piece of this conversation, right? Because if you're looking at where we were a week ago, 2 weeks ago, it was not looking so great. So
also some positive comments from Paul Ryan saying that he actually doesn't want to see DACA rolled back without some kind of replacement in place. Now, who knows whether we should take that more seriously than the repeal and replace talking point that Republicans have been using on healthcare for so long, but still at least positive noises being made there. But back to the latest, which everyone's talking about today, and that's this dinner date that Trump seems to have had with Pelosi and Schumer last night. We've got Pelosi and Schumer saying they struck a deal to hold on rolling back DACA through executive action and wait to replace it with some kind of compromise legislation. And they're saying that the deal that they struck with Trump would not actually be tied to building his beloved huge border wall that we hear so much about. Meanwhile, Trump is saying that that's not quite how he understands it. Do we even know where things stand?
No. No is the easy way of saying it. And I think from what I understand, there's a broad-based agreement on the areas in which they're going to negotiate the terms of legislation, and then they are going to find a way to draft some legislation and put something forward and see where it is. There's going to be an element on border security in there, and then there's also going to be some broad protections for DACA recipients in there as well. Where we end up between those two poles is anyone's guess, but I would say that, again, positive, forward momentum, and we'll see.
Well, I appreciate your optimism for sure. You came in much sunnier than I might have expected for someone who works every day on immigration, given what's at stake. But I have to say, I mentioned Paul Ryan and some of the positive noises he's made, and who knows what to make of that. But at the same time, we're seeing other Republicans in Congress basically saying that they view this by Trump, if indeed there is some kind of loose deal in place, as a capitulation to Democrats, and they don't want to see him giving in that way. Do we see, and do you believe that we're actually seeing the divisive immigration debate bubble back up in Congress? And if so, where do you think things go from here?
So this is actually an interesting point you're making, because from the perspective of Define American and the work that we've done, even in the last 6 months before the election, there was a lot of bipartisan talk on immigration. There was a lot of comedy on immigration. And I would argue among the more sane members of the conservative movement, there's actually a lot of agreement on where they could go with this type of legislation. And so, you know what? At the end of the day, I'm optimistic because there are good people within the conservative movement, and just as there are good people within the progressive movement. And I think together, there's a lot of at stake. But, this is history we're talking about. This is how we are going to define our country for the future. And I think people understand that. And, I'm optimistic that folks are going to be able to look their colleagues in the eyes, roll up their sleeves, and find a way forward here.
Well, your optimism is it's wonderful. It's infectious. I'm feeling better than I did before you walked in. But it's also, I just have to say, it's sort of hard to take very seriously the thought that Trump partnered with certain congressional Republicans, but particularly Trump, is going to do such a significant about-face after essentially running an election that was all about calling Mexicans rapists and murderers and trying to play divide and conquer at a level we haven't seen in a generation.
Well, I would take this out of the context of even Trump, and I would say, again, there are rational members of Congress who are conservative, who exist within that caucus, who 8 months ago were for this type of legislation. And, if you want to take folks at their word, a lot of what they said in the past was that this should always have been Congress that did this work, and it shouldn't have been executive action. They now have that opportunity to legislate. And again, being an optimist, because we have to be right now, because so much is not great out there, I think and I hope that they rise to the challenge, because the ball is firmly in their court. They control everything, and they can decide if they want to be on the right side of history or just kick the can down the road.
So what is at stake if DACA ends up actually being rolled back? You mentioned at the top that, yes, there are real human consequences. A lot of folks have talked about how families may be split up. Young people will lose the opportunity to become the productive members of this society that they so very much want to be. But there are broader impacts as well.
Well, so I think this is an interesting thing, because you hear this a lot in the press, and it's always about they're going to be. And I think it's an important thing to take a step back and just sort of say, they already are. And this is the thing, again, where I feel like folks really are not aware to the degree with which they're already integrated within our society, that these folks are American, that they are out there in the military doing these jobs within our local community that are so important to my everyday life, to your everyday life. And I think when we have that conversation on that scale, folks are left with no choice but to be supportive of fixing something like this, because they don't want to lose the person who takes care of their grandma. They don't want to lose the EMT who is rushing to save somebody in their family who's been hurt, or any of those things. So I think when we have that conversation on that level, and you talk to people about that, they're there. They are already there. And so that, to me, is a critical part of this conversation, because as much as there's the legislative piece, I think if we're having that conversation in the media and we're telling those stories, I think we're always going to be on safe ground, because the American people really like this legislation. They really like what it says about our country. It makes them feel good.
This legislation being comprehensive immigration reform.
Yes.
And DACA.
And DACA and all of these things. And taking taking people who want to be American, giving them the opportunity to do so, and making our country better, right? I think that's what makes and defines our country as a great one.
So we have a caller who's actually been waiting, and his name is Dave. He's in Seattle, Washington, and he's interested in talking about the wall that Trump so deeply wants to build. Dave, you are on with Kristian Ramos from Define American.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my call. Listen, as long as we're dreaming, about DACA reform, what if progressives propose something wild? Instead of a wall that's 15 feet high, how about a riparian protection wild and scenic river zone that's a mile wide for the Rio Grande, the Colorado River, and the Tijuana River on the Mexican border? And I'm really serious about this. I mean, the Rio Grande wildlife area is an enormous source of biodiversity for the United States. Huge numbers of bird species are only found in South Texas. And it's a wonderful place that I happen to really, really like. And why not protect it for a mile on either side? Because you cannot build a wall on the Rio Grande, or you'll destroy the riparian zone. It's not possible. And it's not geologically possible, because of the canyons and stuff. But a mile-wide border is possible, and maybe it'd be good for everybody.
Well, thank you for your call, Dave, and for your thoughts. Kristian, I don't know if you have any response there. It's a new idea for me, certainly. I haven't heard anyone voice that, so I don't know what your thoughts are.
So Define American is a media and culture organization, so we don't really touch the policy side of things. But as somebody who grew up in the Southwest in Arizona, you could probably find some folks down there who would be amenable to something like that, I'm sure.
Well, thank you for your thoughts, Dave. Certainly something creative and new, and not something that I'd heard before, or that I think Kristian has heard before either. But Kristian, before we go to a break, I actually do want to get a little bit into what Define American does, because for folks who aren't familiar with the organization, it's really a very interesting and novel and important mission that you guys are seeking to achieve, and it really gets down to what the name of the organization is: Define American. How do we define the concept of who is an American?
Absolutely. And I think it's so unique in the time that we are in, given that so much of the current conversation around immigration is occurring not just in media, right? Not just in the news, but in your entertainment media. Because Donald Trump is a celebrity, this stuff was a celebrity, and now our president. So much of this conversation is now occurring in popular culture. And, when Define American was founded by Jose Antonio Vargas, he wanted to be very clear that the lens and the prism which we viewed all of these things was, again, how are we defining American, but then also media and culture shifting. And it's important because this conversation is occurring in the living rooms of millions of households across the country because they're inundated with all of this stuff. So how do we get into that conversation? How are we making sure that we have positive representation of immigrants that is accurate and real to the broad spectrum of folks that are out there? How are we speaking to sort of the intersectionality of this issue? Because I would argue DACA is not an immigration issue. It's an American issue. It's something that everybody is going to have to contend with one way or the other should this program go away.
And language is a big piece of that. That's a lot of what you guys are actually tackling is sort of how we talk, how we represent people, what kinds of images are out there in the media. But even the very term illegal immigrant, there's so many different terms out there, but even the terminology that people use can really impact how people envision and what kinds of thoughts go into their heads about the people we're talking about.
Absolutely. And it's such a small, simple rhetorical shift, but it has such a huge impact. And, Define American has always been at the forefront of dealing with that. We got the AP to change how they use the term in the past. And now we're sort of in this space where not only is that term being used more, but you have white supremacists and, literal neo-Nazis on television out there doing their thing.
Briefly in the White House.
Briefly in the White House. Who can say? I don't know. But it's wild. And I would argue that the work that Define American does is now more important than it has ever been, given the place that we are in.